Well, there's Coca-Cola and Pepsi, there is America and Russia, there is of course Apple and Samsung, and in India you have Maruti versus Hyundai. Some rivals really are cutthroat, and these two cars here represent the best of hatchbacks from both these manufacturers. But which one is better and which one should you put your check on? We'll find out on the show today. Well, so the cabin of the Ignis is a lot more youthful and a lot more sporty than the cabin of the Grand i10. The cabin of the Grand i10 definitely feels a lot more mature. And just like the Grand i10, this one also uses a dual tone interior. You get, of course, black on the top of the dashboard and a nice soft white color over here in the middle. And the key styling element inside this car, of course, is the fact that the center console as well as the door handles inside are of the same color as the exterior of this car. And also remember that you get this Adidas kind of logo, which is also found on the outside. The C-pillar also has this logo, so that's a very nice and very neat touch. Now, in terms of overall quality, both these cars are really neck and neck, and also in terms of features as well as overall utility places, both these cars are really neck and neck. So you get the exact same kind of storage spaces inside the Ignis as you do inside the Grand i10, the glove. But today's car does not have a touchscreen system because we are, of course, filming the top-end automatic version. The manual top-end versions do get that touchscreen, and the best part is that the seat squab on these seats is much wider and much longer and better cushion than the ones on the Grand i10, which means that if you are someone who is like me on the heavier side, these seats should offer you more comfort and more relaxation on that long highway trip. So in terms of seat comfort, it is the Ignis which has the edge, but in terms of overall features as well as overall build quality, it is neck and neck. Well, the cabin of the Grand i10 feels a lot more mature and a lot more sophisticated than the one on the Ignis. If the Ignis really is your youthful 21-year-old out of college, this one feels like someone who has been working for about 10 or 15 years and is into his mid-30s or 40s. It really is a very sobering place to be in as well, and it has a certain feel-good factor about itself, which the Ignis does not have. I have to give it to Hyundai engineers who really have designed it in a very sensible and a very practical manner. So in terms of overall features and utility places, both these cars are very close and there's hardly any to choose between these cars. One advantage, in fact two advantages that the Grand i10 has over the Ignis is in the fact that the glove box over here is cool, which means that if you're on a long highway trip, you will always find cold water inside the car. You don't have to stop and buy it from a local dhaba, and you also don't need to carry your pen drive every time you take this car out on that long journey. You don't need to carry that because the stereo system over here has 1 GB of internal storage place. So those are two advantages that this car has over the Ignis. Well, in terms of seat comfort, in isolation, the Grand i10 is pretty okay. The seats offer you decent comfort and support. The only thing is that the support for the lower back isn't very good. The cushioning is slightly on the softer side, so your lower back might tend to become a little tired on those long journeys, unlike the Ignis, which has better support and cushioning. And also the support for the under tires could have been much better inside this car. In isolation, it is pretty okay, but yes, when you compare it with the Ignis, it is slightly behind. So overall, who wins the battle of the front seats? Well, when it comes to overall ambience, it is the Grand i10 which has a slight advantage, but in terms of seat comfort, it is the Ignis which has the edge. Well, the big and boxy shape on the outside means that you get a lot of space on the inside. Now, the front seat has been set for my driving position. My height for reference is 5'10", and because it is raised up, you get plenty of place to keep your feet below it. Headroom is more than adequate, and if you are someone who is about 6 feet or even 6'2" and you prefer sitting up straight like this, these seats should be okay because your head won't be brushing against the roof over here. Now, it's not a very wide car at the back, which means that having two is better, but you can of course adjust the third occupant as well. There is a bit of a hump in the floor panel, but the footwells are quite large enough, which means that whoever's sitting here can always find plenty of place to accommodate his feet. The best part is though that the doors opening is really nice and wide. It almost is at 90 degrees, and the aperture also is pretty big, which means that if you have older people at home, you can simply slide into this car rather than having to crouch and get into it. And you also get big bottle holders at the back, and there's also one over here in the center. The only negative over here is that unlike the Grand i10, you do not get your own AC vent at the back, and that can be a bit of an issue for someone who is not very happy with the thoroughfare from the front. Well, now talking about the legroom and headroom inside the Grand i10, as you can see, it is more than adequate in terms of headroom. Knee room also is more than adequate, and just like the Ignis, the seats are raised inside over here, so you get plenty of place below them where you can stretch your feet. Well, in terms of headroom, knee room, as well as overall room inside the cabin, both these cars are very close. But when it comes to the battle of the back seat, it is the Grand i10 which has a slight advantage. And why is that? Well, because you get your own AC vents which have a decent throw. It's not very solid, but it is decent. And you also get a flattish floor panel, which means you can actually have 3 over here, unlike the Ignis, which is better for 2. And the windows also are bigger on this car. So yes, this one has a slight advantage over the Ignis in the backseat department. But in terms of overall boot area, both these cars are very similar in terms of their capacity, so there's hardly anything to choose between them. And both these cars are also very similar in their shape. You of course get big and boxy kind of boots. There's minimal suspension intrusion in both the cars, and there's a huge loading lip in both these cars as well. So really, as I just said, there's hardly anything to choose between them. In terms of overall usage, you can put in 2 large pieces of suitcase and 1 small item as well. Well, so both these cars come with a petrol as well as diesel engine option. The Ignis gets a 1.2 petrol, just like the Grand i10, but the diesel engine on this car is slightly bigger. The Grand gets a 1.2 litre diesel, while this one gets a 1.3 litre diesel. Well, in terms of diesel performance, it is the Ignis which definitely has the advantage, because the mid-range on this car is far better than the one on the Grand i10. But that said, the performance difference isn't really very huge. It is a marginal difference, but yes, you can notice it. While the gearbox on both these cars is light as well as very slick, the clutch action also on both the diesel and petrol versions is pretty good and pretty linear. Well, as soon as you start driving off the Ignis, no matter which engine is powering it, you will realize that this is a much better car for someone who does consider himself a keen driver and really does seek the thrill of driving. And that's because the steering wheel really is very feelsome. It has loads of communication about itself, and the chassis of this car also feels a lot more agile and a lot more dynamic than the one on the Grand i10. But the best part is that because this car is built on a super lightweight platform, this car is also a lot more nimble to drive around town as well as on the highway than the Grand i10 is. And even when you're pushing this car into corners on those hilly sections, this car definitely has a lot of grip and feels a lot more responsive and a lot more lively to drive than the Grand i10. So what I'm trying to say is that if you're a keen driver and you enjoy having a smile on your face every time you take your car out for a drive, the Ignis clearly has the advantage over the Hyundai Grand i10. Yes, the Ignis has the slight advantage in the automatic gearbox department, because this gearbox, the AMT, uses a 5-speed gearbox, whereas the Hyundai Grand i10 only has a 4-speed gearbox and also only comes in petrol. There's no diesel automatic on offer on the Grand i10. So in terms of flexibility, especially when you're on the highway, it is the Ignis's AMT version which has the edge over the Grand i10. Well, where the Ignis also has a slight advantage is overall in the high-speed ride comfort. In city comfort, both cars are neck and neck, and in terms of slower city speeds, it is the Ignis which is slightly behind than the Hyundai Grand i10. Why is that? Well, simply because this car's suspension has a stiff edge to it, and some of those bumps and potholes at slow city speeds do enter the cabin, while the suspension on the Grand i10 does not allow anything to filter inside the cabin, especially at slow city speeds. Well, so the Grand i10 is a very relaxing car to drive. It's a car which will not tie you down or make you feel exhausted after a long day behind the wheel, because the steering wheel is really light. If you're driving the manual, the clutch is really light. The gearbox really does not take any effort to slot into gears, no matter which version you're driving, the diesel or the petrol, and you get excellent visibility all across. But that's not all. What also makes the Grand i10 better for the city is its soft suspension setup. And what I mean by that is that this car will really take on those rumble strips and pothole roads with complete aplomb. Yes, the suspension on this car works brilliantly over those badly patched up roads, and there's very little which filters into the cabin. So it's not really a car which rewards you for fast highway speeds. And because the steering wheel really is very light, if you're pushing this car into corners on those hilly sections, well, you'll have to back off, because you're not really sure what the tires are doing up ahead. So it's not as great or as much fun to drive as the Maruti Suzuki Ignis is. Well, now this car also, remember, comes in both diesel and petrol, and the petrol motor is slightly sluggish in the lower end of its range, which means that the Ignis has better drivability in the city in terms of the petrol engine. But in terms of overall diesel performance, this car is almost as good as the Ignis. It is slightly behind in the mid-range because the mid-range of the Ignis is really something else and really does solidly pack a punch. The one on the Grand i10 is adequate, but yes, not as good as the Ignis. Where this car has the edge in the diesel engine department is in refinement. Yes, this car is the last word at this price point when it comes to overall diesel refinement. And if you are in the market for a diesel engined premium hatchback which is also affordable, then the Grand i10 is probably your best option out there at the moment, not only compared to the Ignis but compared to all its other rivals. And in terms of gearbox choices, you get an automatic only on the petrol engine version of the Grand i10, which is a bit of a surprise. And the other surprise is the fact that you only get a 4-speed automatic. There is no 5-speed option, which limits its appeal as a highway car and reduces its flexibility. So that's something that maybe Hyundai should now add onto this car, a 5-speed automatic gearbox. Even though the Ignis's AMT gearbox does suffer from a little bit of lag and isn't the smoothest gearbox around, it is better because it has 5 speeds and it's also not very expensive and also is pretty fuel efficient. Well, you'll simply enjoy the ride comfort of the Grand i10 when you're driving it in the city, because this car really does have a nice suspension setup when it comes to slow city speeds. Very little can unruffle the feathers of the Grand i10 and very few bumps and potholes actually enter the cabin. It's really the sharpest of sharp crevices which enter the cabin. So overall, if it's high-speed ride that you're after, it is the Ignis you should go for. If it's slow city speeds that you're after, and primarily if you are someone who drives 90% in the city, then the Grand i10 is the better choice. Well, visibility on the Grand i10 is definitely better than the Ignis. You get a very slender A-pillar, which means you can look around it quite easily. The glass area is quite big and the view from the back also is pretty good. You get a very nice view of the road behind you. So maneuvering this car into that tight parking space below your building should not be an issue. Well, this has been one of the closest comparisons that we've ever had on our show today. And you really can't go wrong with either one of these two cars because both of them are equally good in their own respective rights. But that said, if it's diesel power that you're after, then nothing can beat the smoothness as well as responsiveness of the Hyundai Grand i10's engine. Overall, if it's driving pleasure that you are seeking, then nothing comes close in this category to the Ignis's overall handling as well as crisp steering wheel. But if you err on the side of comfort, then the Grand i10 is a choice for you. And if you are, of course, blaming me for being politically correct, I urge you to go to their respective dealerships and drive both these cars, and I'm sure you'll agree with my verdict. It's bye for now and hope to see you soon.